Hello, welcome back, everyone, to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I'm Jesse Collins, and I'm joined here today with a special guest. It's Karl Stern. Karl is here because Karl undertook a very ambitious project, which was to look at a collection of lists that ranked the greatest wrestlers of all time, and he came up with kind of a modified formula to list the 201 greatest pro wrestlers of all time. And he created this for his site whenitwascool.com and the When It Was Cool Patreon page. And I came across it, I think, over the weekends. And I talked to Karl a little bit about it on the board, but I was really intrigued by the study. And I wanted to have him on the show, and Karl was very kind, and he said that he was totally game for this. So he's on the show now, and um, if people want to read the list, which you might want to take a look at it at least, you can press pause on this podcast. I will link the list in the description. I'll link it out on social media so everyone can find it. But Karl, we really appreciate you coming on the show today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Jesse, and I really appreciate you having me here. I look forward to talking about this, and I really appreciate your support of the project and everything. Appreciate the link you talked about putting up, and I'd really like to get this information out there because I've been I've been working in, I guess, wrestling history for well back into the 1990s, even the late 1980s. I've been working over at WrestlingObserver.com for 15 years or so, and in the process of doing this I learned some stuff. And so I'm not saying, there's a lot of times I obviously seek to learn stuff as a historian, but I learned some things that I wasn't expected to learn from putting this list together, that was really unexpected. And it wasn't so much, hey, this person is ranked, but like, what does that even mean? But I learned a lot about the way people, different groups of people, think about wrestling and wrestling history, and even how the media works, and even how online, the internet, the community of the internet, how it works, how the thought process works. And I've honestly found that more fascinating than any of the results that came out on the list itself, although those two I think are pretty interesting in of themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's really key if people are unfamiliar with this list or the process that went into it. It's really key that this is not Karl's uh list of 201 favorite wrestlers. It's not even a list where you came up with like an objective standard for greatness and gave guys scores based on that. This is entirely a project where you looked at other lists that have been published across across the wrestling medium, whether it was from historians, whether it was from some more mainstream outlets, whether it was from voters voting on things, and you kind of made a consensus ranking based on those lists, and then added in some bonus points for things like if they had made the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame, how high they placed in certain rankings each year. And so it kind of creates this it's both an examination of what does the people who have made lists in the past, who stands out on those lists, who doesn't stand out on those lists, and kind of why that is. And that's more important than just debating about like, oh my God, Ric Flair was number one and Hulk Hogan is number two. How can that be possible? Or whatever, cause you want to pick up by picking apart the list. But it's not a list that you came up with. It doesn't have your opinion in it outside of the fact that you created the idea to kind of combine this consensus into one list.
That's exactly right, because my list would look really different in a lot of ways. I mean, some of it would be similar. Obviously, I think most of us can agree, the top, three or four or five are generally, on most people's opinion, going to be somewhere in there. But, my list would look very different from that because, and this is really just the key point that I was trying to overcome, was what is my personal Karl Stern's criteria of the greatest wrestlers ever? What is Jesse's criteria of the greatest wrestlers ever? What is Dave Meltzer's criteria of the greatest wrestlers ever? What is Bill Apter's, and so on and so forth? And they're all different. We all enjoy wrestling for different reasons. Dave is very much likes the Japanese style of wrestling. He likes you know, dynamic moves. He likes quick athletic wrestling and stuff. And that's fine. And that's great. I mean, we like it for what we like it for. Others may like the storytelling aspects, the drama, uh, the the wrestler in the ring. Just to give an example, like, you know, Jerry Lawler's not the most technical wrestler ever. He's not even a technical wrestler. But you ask anybody in the southern United States, especially as you get closer to Memphis, who the greatest wrestler ever is, and their opinion is probably going to be Jerry Lawler's going to rank high on that list. So why is that? Why can we take things as vastly different as Kenny Omega, uh, Jerry Lawler, Ric Flair, Dusty? Here's a good one: Roddy Piper. Roddy Piper wrestles nothing like Kenny Omega. Wrestles nothing like Kazuchika Okada. Yet somehow different people feel they're in the realm of the greatest. So why is that? How does that work? So I asked the question, well, if we source enough places, if I source enough places, then the question, who is the greatest, takes on a more, I guess, combined meaning. And it rules out those biases. Well, this person's biased toward, you know, Japanese wrestling. This person's biased toward WWE wrestling. This person's biased toward whatever. And you can work those biases out. So what the term I've settled in on, Jesse, is the universal consensus. Okay, so if you just ask, you know, we all love Google. You know, you there's not a question you can't have now that you can't pull up your phone and ask Google. So if I just ask the universe, I said, universe, who is the greatest 201 wrestlers ever? The universe doesn't come back with the question, well, what do you mean by greatest? I just mean greatest, whatever it means. And this is what it would be. So excuse me. So I took 30 different list, ranks, books. These come from magazines. These come from books that people have written. Dave Meltzer and John Molinaro did a book, 100 of the Greatest Wrestlers of All Time, back in the early 2000s. Larry Matisic did a book, The 50 Greatest Wrestlers. Sports Illustrated did a list of the 101 greatest wrestlers, Bleacher Report, so on and so forth. Of course, we know Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine does a top 500 every year that looks at it from a storyline basis, from a kayfabe basis, not from an insider basis. And that opinion's valid also, because that's what is presented on TV. If the question's asked if wrestling were real, well, that would be a realistic look at it. So if you take all those opinions, average them together, what does it come up with? And I realized immediately, well, there's going to be a gigantic historical bias, because Sports Illustrated is not going to have studied Frank Gotch and George Hackett-Smith and William Muldoon and Joe Stecker and all that. So who has? Okay, who's respected that has done that? Well, it's great researchers and historians like Steve Yohe and J. Michael Kenyon, who passed away a few years ago, but so much of wrestling history was saved by him going in there doing this really heavy microfilm laden research back in the days before the internet. So he's a valuable opinion. A guy named Jim Zordani, was known as Clawmaster on the internet. Excuse me. He too has passed away since then, but he did so much research that we all, people who've written newsletters, written books, done podcasts for years, we've used their research. So they know what they're talking about. Chris Zellner, who many people know from the Between the Sheets podcast, he as well. These people actually did a top 100 or something similar to it. And so there's where I got the historical the historical people like Frank Gotch and Strangler Lewis and those folks had a fair chance then to get ranked into this. So the sources I used, about half and half between those.
I wanted to kind of, you mentioned like bias, right? And like what kind of style of wrestling do people like? And kind of it's going to vary from person to person. So when you're making your list, how do you quantify for that? And when I was making my list, and people may or may not know, in 2016, I made a list for Wrestling Inc., where I did the 50 greatest wrestlers of the last 50 years. And when I was making that list, for me at least, I was I was really trying to approach um it in a as a unbiased way as possible. And it wasn't going to be my 50 favorite wrestlers of all time. And it wasn't even going to be 50 my 50 like wrestlers that like how I rank 50 great wrestlers on how much I like them. I really tried to separate myself from the list and be as subjective as possible. And what I mean by that is like I think I had Hulk Hogan third on that list. And it's like Hulk Hogan's not my third favorite wrestler of all time. I personally am not a fan of Hulk Hogan's act or his shtick. But at the end of the day, Hulk Hogan, I have to respect the impact he had on the business. I had to have to respect the fact that he was incredibly popular, that he was this huge money drawing star for an extremely long period of time. And that I have to factor that in. And that's almost like more it's not only are you looking at all these lists, Karl, that have maybe individual biases by the author, but also the authors in the most part trying to avoid their own personal biases in their own different ways. And that can be really challenging.
Yeah, exactly right. But that's thought I had in using so many different lists to average out those bias. So if you take someone who is saying, I'm going to rank this by drawing power. Okay, that's to me that's the most important thing. If this figurative person said that's the most important thing, is drawing power.
And it tends to
Okay,
be on
well,
these lists.
what does that even? Yeah, exactly. But what does that even mean? Okay, what? How do you often hear Jim Lundos was the greatest draw of all time. Well, how do we know that? Okay, yeah, Jim Lundos drew a lot of paying people to the crowd, but Jim Lundos also didn't have, at least early in his career, television exposure. What ratings did did Jim Lundos draw?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Pay per view. None of that existed back then, so it's a totally different metric. So how does that compare to Hulk Hogan? Was Jim Lundos a bigger draw than Hulk Hogan? By what metrics do you use? Because it's changed over the years, even more so for people like Frank Gotch or whatever. And even in recent years, the great change in cable television versus the internet today. How do you compare a John Moxley to somebody as recent as Steve Austin? Because the world they perform in front of, media wise, is so vastly different. You're never going to see those millions of people that watch Steve Austin and The Rock and Bill Goldberg on TV again, because the cable universe that occurred in does not exist anymore. It's YouTube views and things like that. The social media followers, and people say, well, that doesn't count, that doesn't mean business, but that's the world we live in. So if you count that against people, they jump way down the list because that universe doesn't exist anymore. And again, you think about that, if you're talking about draws and stuff, well, then why isn't Bill Goldberg ranked higher on most people's list than he generally is? Why then? And so you take all these different lists, you take all these different criteria, and if you get enough diverse opinion, those biases average out, I feel like. And in doing this list and stuff, one thing I would do differently if I do this again in the future, or if I had to do it again, I would actually probably try to hit closer to 50 lists. It's hard to find the quality and the criteria, because again, just like you mentioned, the list you had, which I looked over, and it's a very great list, the one you did for that criteria, but again, you only did like the most recent 50 years or so, I think.
Yeah.
And so how do you factor in people like William Muldoon and Frank Gosh or whatever? So the bias in your list, which you admittedly said you're trying to be very subjective, non-subjective with, the bias is actually because it's more modern. And so how do you average that out? Well, you have to get lists that have historical rankings and stuff. So the consensus is what I was looking for, the consensus of ideas. And even in that, I discovered so much stuff I didn't expect. I think, Jesse, if you'll think about it for a minute, if you look, you're obviously familiar with Inside Wrestling. You're part of the board. You obviously an observer, subscriber, and you have a podcast. So you're in deeper than most. You're more knowledgeable than most people. So when I throw out a name like Ultimate Warrior or Bill Goldberg, like immediately, probably most people like you who are super knowledgeable about wrestling think, well, they don't belong on that list. Those wrestlers are terrible. Yet, if I meet an average person on the street who's a fan of wrestling, and maybe they don't subscribe to the Observer or whatever, but they love it. They buy a ticket to go. They watch it on TV and everything else. And I say, name 5, 10 wrestlers. They're going to be on that list, and they're going to say, "Oh, he's my favorite. I loved Ultimate Warrior or whatever. Bill Goldberg's great." I said, "Do you think they're among the greatest?" Well, yeah, of course they are. He beat Hulk Hogan. Whatever. So that opinion is not invalid just because it doesn't meet your criteria because he did good, because he wasn't a great technical wrestler, did great flips and all this other stuff, does not invalidate that opinion. That opinion is still very valid. Why do I don't know. I found him like Ultimate Warrior, for example. I found him utterly terrible, but a lot of people didn't. A lot of people, that was one of their favorite wrestling memories. So how do you quantify that? How do you put a label on that when you're talking about art? And that's what's so different between wrestling and other and sports. You can keep up with how many touchdowns a person made or how many home runs somebody made or all these verifiable statistics. Well, wrestling's actually closer to like music or something or acting, but even with acting and with music, you can quantify the bigger draws, right? Just like you can in wrestling. Who sold the most records? Who sold the most movie tickets or whatever? Yet you've got these really great actors who are tremendous, have great talent that maybe they were never in a big blockbuster or something like that. So how do you qualify that? So that's to me more relatable to wrestling than another sport. That's why it's so hard to do, because what your opinion is and my opinion may differ greatly.
Yeah, I think like if I just look at the top 10 year list, right? So your top 10 in order is Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, Steve Austin, Lou Thesz, Andre the Giant, Bruno Sammartino, The Rock, Frank Gotch, Harley Race, and Dusty Rhodes. I think that top 10, it wouldn't be necessarily my top 10, but I think that's a really fair, like those are pretty much all the names you would expect to be in the top 10 or around it. There's no real shocking developments.
Yeah, again, you swap any of those out to your personal, preference. But yeah, again, I think
And it
most
also,
people.
yeah, and it also encompasses a really wide, and this is what's really interesting about what you did, was that it really encompasses a very wide range of time. It's not all 1985 and on pro wrestlers. There's people like Frank Gotch, who wrestled over 100 years ago on the list. There's Lou Thesz, who started his career almost 100 years ago on that list, in addition to, your more modern stars like The Rock or, Steve Austin. And I found that that's kind of interesting, that kind of balance you were able to find on the list. And what's interesting to me is as you continue to go down the list and look at all the rankings, and this is kind of a testament to the kind of combination you went with, looking for people like Larry Matuszak and Steve Yohe and these guys who have done a ton of research and are very well versed in the history of pro wrestling dating back to its very, very beginning, is that the list does a really good job recognizing, maybe they're not all in the right spots, but recognizing guys who wrestled an extremely long period of time ago, who many people, even people who consider themselves wrestling historians or huge, big wrestling fans, don't know. People like, you mentioned Joe Stecker, but I'm thinking like even like people like John Pesek or Earl Caddock or William Muldoon. Like those guys are not ever being discussed really, even in hardcore wrestling circles. Yet they're represented on this list because you went out of your way to kind of really look for guys who had lists that were going to stretch back and recognize these lesser known people from extremely long time periods ago.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I was shocked John Piesick made the list. They come in at number 70 because John Piesick's a guy I knew a lot about. He'd been a particular favorite of mine because of some of the things he was involved with back long ago, as far as like real. I've always been interested, like really in the real shooters, like the real, and people have such a misunderstanding. They may think that the long ago guys like Farmer Burns and Frank Gotch and all that, they were all shooting matches, and so these were great shooters. That is so far from the truth. So far from the truth. Pro wrestling in the United States of America has been largely a worked originally to fleece gamblers out of their money, but later on for entertainment purposes. But it's largely been a work and a cooperation since day one. There was a lot more real legitimate stuff that went on back then, but it was not, I don't believe, even the majority. I mean, newspapers by the 1870s were already calling wrestling largely fake. By the 1870s, Frank Gott's not even born. So that's the world it comes from. So I've always been kind of interested in these shooters and stuff, and John Piesick really seems like he is. So why do you never hear about John Piesick? And this is, Jesse, is what I'm talking about when it comes to bias. What we know about wrestling is largely what we're told, okay? And there may not be a sinister component behind it, but people have their favorites. Let's be honest. If you followed Observer like I have since the mid-1980s, I've read the Observer since the 80s. I've known Dave Meltzer since, we first met in the early 1990s. So, but let's face it, he really likes Japanese wrestling, and he really likes very dynamic in-ring wrestling stuff, and less so the story-driven and character-driven stuff, in my opinion. Now, he might argue, but that's just been my general consensus of it. So when you look back at people like John Piesick and you go, why do we not know of him? Obviously, enough historians did to rank him there, but why do we not know about him? Well, it's because before the internet, before people like J. Michael Kenyon did all his research, and Steve Yohe did all his research, and went through all these newspapers, the only thing we knew about that era of pro wrestling is what Lou Thez told us in his book Hooker. He was the only link back to that era. And so what he wrote about in that book and Fall Guys and whatever happened to Gorgeous George, those were really our only sources pre-internet, and the historical research by the guys I mentioned was what we know. So if you weren't important to Lou Thez, or he didn't like you, well, he didn't talk about you, right? I mean, if you're writing your memoir, you're not going to mention, positively people you didn't like, your coworkers or whatever, or people you didn't really know that much. So people like John Piesick get kind of left out. Well, it turns out, he's a really scary guy, John Piesick was. And enough historians, there's been enough work done now that is out. But that just goes to show you the bias in what we know. Larry Matisick, I had Larry Matisick on my show several times before he passed away. He was obviously come from that. St. Louis was the hub of wrestling back in, and he come up through that, even promoted, wrestling in St. Louis. Very much tied to Sam Muchnick and that whole era there. So he's a guy that should absolutely know what he talks about, right? Well, I go through his book. I read his book. I even talked to him about his book at the time. And he was really biased against Southern wrestling. I mean, he had no respect for the Memphis style of wrestling. Even people like, you think, the Rock and Roll Express and Midnight Express, like he had really no great consideration for them. And that goes in the face of what a lot of other people consider their most important stuff, their quote greatest stuff. So there's bias that creeps in everywhere, depending on who's telling the story. And so that's one of the things, one of the more interesting things I discovered. You notice if you go through this, I grew up a Southern wrestling fan. I don't know if you can tell by my accent or not. That's a joke, by the way. Obviously, I'm from the South. I grew up watching both Memphis wrestling and Ron Fuller's Southeastern wrestling. That was what got me into wrestling. What I loved, studied, and knew. The 200 list has virtually no Southern wrestlers on it, save Jerry Lawler. Why? Because most of the media never covered it, never paid much attention to it, didn't give it much, look down upon it, quite frankly. Why? Because that was the prevailing opinion of wrestlers at the time back in the day. You talk to your big NWA stars like, Harley Race and Jack Briscoe and people like that. And while they worked Memphis and that's the Southern wrestling areas, they didn't respect it and they didn't like it. So when the reporters come along, the newsletter writers come along, the authors come along writing the books, and they talk to these people, obviously they don't give them a good review of it, don't give them a good deal. So we lose people like Ron Wright and Whitey Caldwell and all these guys who go back in the past, that if those wrestlers worked the Olympic in Los Angeles or worked the Cow Palace in San Francisco, they would have much greater reverence for them. And so there's a bias as well. And that would stood out to me more than probably any. Just recently, of course, we had the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame ballot, and Dave put Roy Welch on it as a promoter. And I thought, well, that's a no-brainer. I talked to several other people. Well, that's a no-brainer, of course. Well, he didn't do very well. Certainly didn't get in. And so again, people are quantifying with projects like this, and even the Observer Hall of Fame and so on. People are quantifying what they know. The problem is there's a lot more out there that we don't know, and there's a lot of other opinions, and very much, and I know people don't like to hear this term, but I've experienced it to be true. There's very much a bubble among different, not just fans, but publications and stuff, where they have a worldview of what wrestling history is. And that's, they're going to stand firm on that. And everything outside that bubble is not legitimate or not whatever. But I tried to get beyond the bubble with this list. And that's why you end up with people like Bill Goldberg on here that, wouldn't necessarily get it. Weird stuff to me is like Kurt Hennig and Jake Roberts.
Yeah, those are the ones. Those are the ones that are, to me, the interesting ones, are the guys who again, you talked about, like, it all comes down to who is remembered, and kind of people that were on the national stage are going to be remembered much more. So guys who came up in what we would consider the national era, which is what, like, early to mid 1980s, probably up through today technically, but really through the Monday Night Wars. And those guys, especially someone like Kurt Hennig, who's kind of like an early stage internet darling. Like, before we really had the internet, Kurt Hennig was the smart fan favorite because he did, he was a very good technical wrestler, and he sold really well, and he did a lot of things well, that he wasn't always pushed like he was the biggest star, but became kind of an early stage fan favorite of the hardcore fans, the Wrestling Observer newsletter guys. And you mentioned like what do we see as historical bias? And you mentioned the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, which we cover extensively on this show, and I've been featured in other places and things like that. And I have a Hall of Fame. I'm a Hall of Fame voter. You're a Hall of Fame voter too, obviously, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so some of the people about, like, a guy who I think is I was talking about this a lot this year, is like Johnny Rougeau, right? Or Jacques Rougeau, whatever you want to call him. To me,
yes,
I read that excellent article that Pat Laparde did a couple years ago talking about his career, and you look at the longevity of his career and the longevity of his drawing power and his success as the top drawing act in Montreal and all these things. And to me, I read that and I'm like, oh, this guy should be a Hall of Fame candidate. This guy should easily be in. He's got a tremendous case, but he's yet to get in. And part of the reason I've thought that is, for all of these things that kind of, you talked about bias and regional bias, I think for Johnny, in the specific case of Johnny Rougeau, but you can take this for anybody who maybe has an excellent case on paper. He's from just too far ago for some people to really consider him, because he's more of a 50s, 60s, maybe early 70s wrestler, as opposed to maybe that next generation where more voters are probably more familiar with. He's from a non-English speaking territory, which hurts. There's not a lot of video evidence of him, which hurts. And the video library wasn't purchased by WWE, so we haven't, had the same kind of access we've had to maybe some other promotions. And all of that works against him establishing his case. You mentioned there are a lot of Southern wrestlers, and I think that's also part of it, is that not a lot of people are going to be familiar with Ron Fuller's wrestling promotion. That's Southeast, right?
Right. Yeah. Southeastern Continental later on. Yes.
Yeah, not everyone's going to be really familiar with that. And so the accomplishments of those talents, even you could say, oh, they drew, this many fans. And if they did that in New York City, or they did that in Chicago, or they did that in Charlotte, North Carolina, they would get in. But because it was in this territory, and that's for whatever reason, maybe it's because the video library isn't easily accessible. Maybe it's because there haven't been a few champions in media that have been prominent spokespeople of them. You mentioned like Roy Shire's territory in San Francisco. Those talents are generally well represented in the Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, and that's because Dave Meltzer has been, it's Dave's childhood territory. He knows the most about it, and he's going to write all about it all the time. So a lot of people are familiar with the stars of that territory more than they are in other territories. And all of that goes into what ends up happening with these lists is that people just, not necessarily that they're unfamiliar with all of these names, but they never really consider them for like ranking them highly on a list like this. And I think that all contributes to kind of the interesting study of who gets remembered, who gets and therefore who gets evaluated to be considered one of the greatest wrestlers of all time.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with everything you just said there. And you brought up Pat LaPrade, and I talked to him the in the process of doing this list and everything, and he's one of those that's outside the bubble. Okay, so we're learning a lot of stuff because the books he's written and the research he's done. He's one of those guys that is exposing us to a lot of stuff that previously wasn't part of the conversation, and maybe that's the better term to use, is not part inside a bubble, but part of the conversation in around certain publications or whatever. I think also Chris Zeldner, the same thing would be said about him and David Bixenspan, and they a lot of times their opinion kind of goes against the grain as well as seems, you think about it for a second, you think, wow, these people are very popular, very well known. Why are they not highly considered amongst like the observer readership or something? And it's because it's just a little bit outside that conversation sphere. It's a different sphere. People like Bo James, who have done a lot of research about the Appalachia area of wrestling. And here's the thing that I will say. Now, I'm not an expert on the Appalachia wrestling history, but I am of the Deep South. And one of the reasons I think we get so underappreciated is because wrestling here was really not just a entertainment thing, a source of entertainment. Like you go to in New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco, whatever, you go there for your entertainment. It was literally part of the culture here. It was literally in the culture. There were, you ask the average person on the street in, Jackson, Tennessee, if they know who Tojo Yamamoto is, and you'll get story upon story upon story. Now, Tojo was a terrible wrestler by our standards of today, but there was something about him that communicated to the culture here, and that is important. I feel like that is as important as whether you can do pretty moves and whatever. And that's, you ask people, who maybe have never read a newsletter in their life, somewhere in northern Mississippi, who the greatest wrestler ever is, and Jackie Fargo and Tojo Yamamoto and Jerry Lawler and all the Bill Dundee and all this is going to come up. Yet none of them, say Jerry Lawler, got on this list, nor even close to it, anywhere even in the realm. Uh-huh. And I understand this, the scope of this list is huge. It's worldwide. There's names from Japan and everything else. But anyway, to transition, not to drag that out any further, it should. One other thing that I will say I did see a bias in, and this is, I haven't yet figured out how to get this bias out, or if you even can, but that is of the most current, the most modern names. And I don't think people may initially think, well, it's because people look down upon the old saying, well, this wrestling's not as good as it used to be, or whatever. And I don't think that's the case at all. Actually, I think there is a historical significance bias, meaning that the people that write these books, make these lists, do these rankings, and really the one that's the most current that stays up all the time is the Pro Wrestling Illustrated Top 500 because they do it every year. So it's got your newer people in it. And so by using a cumulative list of theirs, it greatly benefited the newer wrestlers. But this has also been one of my problems with the Observer Hall of Fame is that these very current guys, like your Kazuchika Okadas and your Kenny Omegas and you know whoever the latest darling of the day is, Will Ospreay, whatever, as good as they are, as great as they are, and they are great. Make no mistake about it. I'm not taking anything away from. I'm not one of those guys who looks down upon on that style of wrestling. Not at all. They're doing acrobatic stuff, and even story match driven story stuff that is great. But what is the historical significance, even not of just them, but of this era? Like, where does it even fit? And it takes a while for that to kind of percolate. I think John Moxley's one of the greats of this era. I think he's going to settle into a place in history that's going to be well remembered. But it's just going to take time to get it in there. Roman Reigns is a guy who, man, I just couldn't stand. He was shoved down our throats for years and years and years, and then he finally just through attrition, finally is like, you know what, he's pretty good. He really is. He's probably, it took long enough, but he's pretty darn great. So it takes a little while for that to all kind of fit where it needs to go. And I think that is a bias against some of these. Now, some of those very people I named did make the list, and they probably, if it's done again in 10 years, will be higher up on the list if things go accordingly to the trajectory they're currently on. We'll see. But I think that's interesting. To me, I learned a lot more about the wrestling media, the wrestling world at large, than I did about maybe any particular person. Again, I would never have put Kurt Hennig and Jake Roberts as high as they were, but there they are. The universal consensus is, and mostly that's based on mainstream sources that were in there, they rank them higher because, again, they were famous from probably their childhood. They remembered them well.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. I found all that to be interesting.
Yeah, with the modern wrestlers, I think part of it is also like you have this big list of sources that you're using, and people who are still crafting their legacy today, they're not going to be represented. Like the Dave Meltzer and the Wrestling Observer newsletter Top 100 book that came out 20 years ago. That book doesn't have Kenny Omega or Kazuchika Okada ranked on it because it's way before they even, at least in Okada's case, it was before he even started his career. Obviously, if Dave were to release that book now, I'm sure both those guys would be in the top 100. I think an old sports writer I used to work with told me that boxing and baseball are the only two sports where people think that the old guys were better than the athletes of today. And I would add wrestling to that list as far as, I think, for the reasons you said, whether it's childhood nostalgia, whether it's hard to find an appropriate perspective on where someone stands today as they're active, and we don't have the kind of time to look back at their careers and see what they actually meant to the wrestling world. And there's a trepidation to rank active wrestlers for a variety of reasons. And so it's hard to look at any list really and see like how do you fairly evaluate a modern wrestler, a wrestler that's
that's a really good. I want to interject here real quick because you said something that's really, I think, profound. You mentioned like boxing and baseball and what you said about that, and I think that's true. I would add, because wrestling, again, less sports equivocable. I would also say that also applies to music, because when you go into the grocery store, you're hearing Journey and Leonard Skinner and Madonna and Billy Joel, and not necessarily the acts of the moment. Because there is that nostalgia there. There is, you ask the person on the street, hey, who's the greatest pop star of all time? They're going to say people like the Beatles and Elvis and Rolling Stones, and they're not necessarily wrong. But where are the current artists? where are the, whoever's in the got the top song. I don't know what the Billboard top number one song right now is, but where does that person rank? The whoever. Well, they're not going to rank in the top 5 or 10 because they're still hewing out their place in history, right? They may be the number one person for the moment, but is there going to be consistency? Is that going to hold up over time? Is it going to be well remembered? Is it going to be historically discussed?
And we're talking about
So
a
I think it's
list.
that too.
A list has a finite amount of spaces. So if you're updating your list, year after year, you have to make some difficult calls where if you want to add somebody from today, that means you have to move somebody who you previously thought was on the list out. And that can be a challenge for some people. It would be like if I were saying, if I want to be like, Kenny Omega, I think he's one of the 10 greatest in-ring performers of all time. If I just said that, which I don't think would be that controversial of opinion, but then if I wanted to put him in my top 10, I'd have to move somebody like, oh, what am I going to do? Move Bret Hart or move Mitsuharu Misawa out? Like that's a difficult call for people to make. So people, I think, often tend to side on the people who historically that they've felt have been constantly in their thought process, which obviously a modern wrestler can't be. You could say the same thing about like movies or music or anything like that. Like, okay, if I want to say a movie that came out last year is one of the 10 greatest movies of all time, it might be. There's no reason why a movie that comes out today couldn't be one of the 10 best movies of all time. But what am I going to do?
Exactly.
I'm moving Gone with the Wind or The Wizard of Oz out. Like it becomes like a much harder challenge when you're asking people on a list which has a finite amount of space to make a difficult call, which is to put a new thing over something that they've become old, familiar with, and trust.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. That's actually brilliant. I mean, absolutely perfect. To go along with that very thing, you brought it up, and I'm glad you did because it reminded me for an example of historical context and significance is a thing that's going on. I've noticed going on for the past 3 or 4 years and really happening right now, and that is the discussion between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels of which is the best. Is it just me, or have you noticed this also that there is a change in the narrative of that going on? Where
I feel like I feel like it's been going on for my entire life. But it
I
does
feel like it's come back up again here recently, like in the last, I say recently, 5 years or so.
well, I
Like
think
I really feel like that Shawn Michaels has been considered the better of the two for the majority of the last 20 years, but now that narrative's changing. Am I wrong on that, or are you seeing that too? Do you feel differently?
yeah, I mean, it's always been, to me, at least from my perspective, and I'm going to have very different perspective from you, Karl, because I was born in 1994. I don't know when you were born, but I assume it was before 1994.
Oh yeah, 1971. So
Yeah. No, but that's good because we have two different generational perspectives on this. So
absolutely.
me as a wrestling fan, growing up as a kid, I don't remember Bret Hart. He left WWE with the WWF when I was 3 years old. But when I was first getting into wrestling, which was watching WWE, I was, Shawn Michaels was in kind of his second stage of his career. And he was, obviously this tremendous performer. And he had all these great WrestleMania matches against Chris Jericho and later The Undertaker and doing all this stuff. And I would say people that are my age are more prone to being like Shawn Michaels is better than Bret Hart, or Shawn Michaels is the guy in the right in the whatever you want to, however you want to side on Shawn Michaels' side, because I have childhood familiarity with Shawn Michaels as opposed to Bret Hart, who was this guy from a different era, who was would come across as bitter in his when he would speak on Wrestling Today and things like that. Now personally, me, I like Bret Hart more than Shawn Michaels. And I do think that sometimes it's more of a Bret Hart does the little things and Shawn Michaels does the showmanship and the flashy stuff, while Bret Hart is the more, very cerebral. Everything he does in the ring means something. He's maybe not the most outwardly athletic guy, which Shawn Michaels was in his prime, but he's doing all these things that are real, like thinking man's kind of appreciations of wrestling. I think like WWE, doing a lot more like documentaries and stuff on the Montreal Screwjob and kind of, I think it was the 25th anniversary of the Screwjob was last year, right? I
That's
think
right.
I think that brought it into the forefront on social media and places like that, where people are now talking a lot more about Shawn versus Bret. And it's also kind of
That's a good point.
It's
Yeah.
also kind of like a more of like a ideological line in the sand, which for like what type of wrestling are you going to prefer? Are you a Shawn, if you're a Shawn Michaels fan, that says something about you. And if you're a Bret Hart fan, that says something about you. Just like the way like maybe like being a WCW or a WWF fan did back, in the 90s.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I never understood that tribalism between them because when I was growing up, I mean, there were so many territories. The territories were all out there, and you didn't. I mean, you probably had your favorite, but you weren't against anybody else. In fact, you found it interesting, man. I can remember this is no joke, Jesse. When growing up as a 13, 14-year old guy, I could on Saturday morning, I could watch Continental Wrestling, World Class Wrestling, Memphis Wrestling, WWF syndicated show, WCW Worldwide, and probably occasionally some other just weird out there. Something like we got World Wrestling Council for a minute, or something else, UWF, whatever. And like that was every Saturday. I could sit and watch till after lunch, wrestling constantly. And I never sat around and thought, we're going to show these world class jabronis, how great, it never was that. It was always like, cool, now I get to watch the Von Erichs for a little bit. Cool, now I get to watch this. Yeah. And, Dusty Rhodes is on. It was, I never got into, even in the Monday Night War era, which by that point in time, I was actually promoting independent wrestling and involved in that. I never understood, like I was a channel flipper, whatever was good, I was watching. And then when the commercial come up, I'd flip to the other channel and see what they were doing. And so I was a fan of all of it. I don't get this huge hatred that AEW fans have for WWE or WWE fans have for AEW. I just don't get that. I'm like, it would be great if all of it would excel and do very, very, very well. But
Yeah,
just to jump back real quickly to the Bret Hart Shawn Michaels thing, just for a second. See, back in the day, I was a fan of Shawn Michaels. I mean, Shawn Michaels was one of my favorites. I thought he was incredible, and I thought Bret Hart was utterly boring. He just bored me to tears.
mm-hmm.
And now here in 2023, I've flipped. I see so much brilliant stuff going back and watch that Bret Hart did that I just missed. It just went over my head back then. That where Shawn Michaels was, and it was a product of the popular culture at the time. I think where I was in my 20s then, and I was watching this, and Shawn Michaels was brash and he was disrespectful, and that was part of his whole society was as well. And Bret Hart was this boring old bitter codger who was just whatever. And now I look back, and maybe it's because I've become a boring old bitter codger. I don't know. But what I look back and I see Bret Hart and some of the minor things he was doing, I just missed. I just misunderstood or didn't catch. And it's very interesting because I even myself have kind of switched teams when it comes to those two. And if I could, before we wrap up here today, I'd like to actually flip flip here for a second, then, because this is very interesting. You brought up something a few minutes ago is very interesting. You and I are generationally different, and I'd like to ask you a couple questions if I could, because I find that fascinating.
No, go for
Like
it.
when people talk about, like, when I talk about the heyday of my wrestling fandom, which was people like Ric Flair and that era, the Road Warriors and stuff like that, Dusty Rhodes and Magnum TA and that sort of stuff. What do you think about that? Like, you weren't there to experience that. You only know of that from other people talking or what you've watched on YouTube or the WWE Network or whatever. Which, of course, you couldn't have been there. You didn't have the current context at the time where I did. You didn't, the music and all that going together with the promos and all that. So when you look back at that stuff, how do you see the people like that? How do you see Ric Flair at that era, Dusty Rhodes and Road Warriors, people like that? Do you see it as some archaic, boring stuff, or do you see it compared to today as being like, how does someone your age and your generation see that, having not lived it and experienced it? I'm
Yeah, I mean,
curious.
it's hard for me to speak for my entire generation. I'll stress at the start by saying that very clearly I have an unusually high interest in historical wrestling. Um, but to me, like, so I'll use Jerry Lawler as a really good example. And so for me, Jerry Lawler like I can go back and I'm watching prime Jerry Lawler in Memphis. I will not be able to appreciate it the way someone like you or any fan that was watching it in that moment was. I'm just that it just can't happen. It's wrestling is about time and place, and I am not in that time and place. But I can at least I can appreciate, even if I can't appreciate his performance, and I'm kind of hit and miss on how much I like Jerry Lawler. But even if I can't inherently appreciate his performance, I can watch the crowd. I can see the business that he did. And I can say, like, wow, he did really good business, or wow, look at how much heat he's getting, or oh, how much the crowd is behind him, depending on what storyline he was in. And I have the context and the ability to be like, okay, even if I objectively am like, this isn't my style of wrestling, this isn't like extremely entertaining to me, but objectively, I can sit back and I can say, this guy understood his audience. He understood how to get over. He understood how to get people to come to the building every week or to watch on television every week. And that's what like greatness is to me. And I'm always fascinated by going back and reading about certain wrestlers who were able to capture something, and certain promoters who were able to capture something. I'm from Boston. Okay. I've become over the years very fascinated with the first half of the 20th century of wrestling in Boston with Paul
It
Bowser
was
as
a
the
huge deal. Yes,
right.
absolutely huge
And
deal.
a lot of that is um not super well covered. Almost all wrestling pre 1950 is poorly covered, like you said when we were talking about Joe
Absolutely.
Pesek.
When's the last time you heard anything about Steve Crusher Casey? Like really?
Like
Yeah, you're exactly right.
relatively recently, but I'm the wrong person to ask about that because that's Irish Steve Casey is someone that I'm really interested in. Is this, Irish
Yeah,
born rowing champion who Paul
right.
Bowser was able to turn into this huge drawing card.
Yeah, his whole
Um,
family was huge athletes. You know
and
that. Yeah.
I've advocated for him to get at least on the ballot for the Observer Hall of Fame. Because
Well,
he's
see,
never
okay, so here's the deal. Yeah, you do a really good. But I have to say, you do a really good job with this. You got talent for this podcasting deal. So,
thank you.
when for the observer ballot come around again, you and I are going to have to correspond, and we're going to see what we can do about getting that happen. I got McLaughlin on there, and I actually got him in. We're going to work on Steve Crusher Casey because
So you're responsible
I
for
think
Colonel
he's a very interesting addition.
So you're responsible for Colonel
Yeah.
McLaughlin
Mm-hmm.
getting into the Hall of Fame.
Myself and Matt Farmer, yeah. Matt Farmer and myself really pushed McLaughlin getting in,
Yeah.
and we wrote the biographies there for the Observer for that issue. Yeah.
Well, I asked Dave, and this was on Wrestling Observer Radio because it was in the mailbag. And this kind of goes back to what we were previously talking about, like people who are, hey, whether they have advocates or whether they were just more recent. So like I've always been like, so like Morris Siegel to me as a non-wrestler has an excellent case to get into the Hall of Fame. And I look at him compared to Don Owen, who eventually did get voted in. And Don Owen's big calling card for getting into the Wrestling Hall of Fame, Observer Hall of Fame, was mostly that he was a promoter for an extremely long period of time and had incredible longevity, um, out of Portland in the Pacific Northwest. And Morris Siegel to me is basically a promoter for the same amount of period of Don Owen, and he was probably a more significant promoter when it comes to drawing larger audiences and having more, giant houses and things like that. And I was like, and Dave put in Lou Darrow and who's the other guy, Johnny Doyle.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
and Steve Yohe wrote these really long, incredibly well-researched articles that kind of convinced Dave to put him in. And I asked Dave, I said, so Morris Siegel's basically is a contemporary of Lou Darrow. And
Mm-hmm.
how come Lou Darrow automatically gets in? But now Morris Siegel's got to get on the ballot. And Siegel's unlikely to get in on the ballot because he was a promoter from so long ago. And there's really not a ton of information on him. I've researched it a lot, and it's hard to find stuff unless you're going through Houston Chronicle microfilm. It's hard to find a lot of stuff on Morris Siegel. So I don't think he's ever going to get in. And Dave even admitted in the Observer that Morris Siegel probably should get in, but is unlikely to ever get the votes because he was so long ago, and a lot of the voters aren't going to vote for a promoter from the 1930s. Um, And I just said, Dave, why don't you just put Morris Siegel in if you think he's going to get in, if you think he deserves to get in, but no, he'll never get the votes. And he's like, well, he's already on the ballot, so we can't take him off the ballot and put him in. It's a whole thing, but I'm working on it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's a few others that's the case for that, kind of like James McLaughlin, who obviously who's going to vote for James McLaughlin, but he should be in. There should be some of those that's a definite difficulty with the Observer Hall of Fame. But
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought it up before we wrap up
I
here,
wanted to
because
ask you one.
that was good.
I want to ask you. I wanted to ask you another thing about your list. So you had all these things, this formula designed to kind of come up with the consensus list, but you also included some negative things at the very end to kind of, you had a couple of lists of worst wrestlers, which you kind of put a penalty on. Can you describe like why you decided to do that and kind of what kind of how that impacted the list?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, it was only a very minor penalty. It was like 5 points, and then we're talking about people. The top of the list are people that like Ric Flair was like 3,000 something points. So it was. I thought it was. I thought I should just have a little bit of a counterbalance just in case. And really, I wanted more to see if any of the people that were on there actually were on the best of also. So, because that's an opinion, right? If these are the worst of all time, well, that's an opinion as well. As it turns out, it was negligible. It didn't affect anybody in any way whatsoever. But I found it interesting that at the end of the day, when I had my list done, there were some people that had like negative 5 points on the list instead of up in the hundreds and thousands of points. But I thought, well, that's if these are the worst, that's a valid opinion also. And so let's just get 2 or 3 and just see. It was more of an experiment to see if that was valid methodology rather than actually affecting anything. And by only penalizing 5 points, didn't affect him. I don't even recall. There might have been 1 or 2 people that got those 5 point negative, but it didn't affect their placement at all. And if I were to do this list again in the future, I don't know that I would use that as a kind of a counterbalance as well. Might come up with a different way in case there's a school of thought out there that is like very much anti something else that's valid. And so that was kind of a sort of an experiment of the methodology just to see if it was working. And really, I didn't find it made any effect whatsoever. But I found it interesting, but negligible. Obviously, Elegante is not on anybody's list of the greatest wrestlers of all time. So
the truth is, well,
made no.
Right. It's one of those things like worst wrestler of all time. Like the worst wrestlers of all time are probably people that we've never actually seen matches of because they were so bad that they never made tape.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
I'm assuming these lists would have people maybe like the Ultimate Warrior or Bill Goldberg or these guys who are big stars but associated with having a low skill level in certain circles.
Yes, exactly that.
And the last thing I wanted to ask you about real quick was we talked about like there's no standard for greatness, right? We're not just looking at drawing, we're not looking at in-ring ability, just what is greatness? And
subjective, yes.
Yeah, and there are two guys that are good examples, but one guy in particular that I find really interesting as far as a discussion point for greatness is Sting.
Yes.
So we talk about Sting, and I'll say this as someone who did not grow up with Sting at all. It really actually wasn't until he was in AEW that I really was able to kind of really appreciate what kind of star Sting was. And part of it is because and this is one of the reasons it was so hard to get Sting into the Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame, was that people look at Sting's career and they might say like, oh, well, he really didn't have that many great matches. And as a drawing card, when he was pushed hard in WCW really struggled and things like that. But if you look today, if you ask a bunch of people like, oh man, who do you think is a great wrestling star? And people say Sting. And maybe at his time, Sting wasn't drawing a ton of people to pay-per-view. But historically, as we look back on his career, you can find so many people that Sting is their favorite wrestler or one of their favorite wrestlers. I think The Undertaker is kind of like this too, where The Undertaker is probably remembered as being a bigger star than he really was comparatively to his peers. But at the end of the day, when we talk about what is greatness, isn't like what Sting has done and what Sting means to people. And when I'm sitting at an AEW show and I'm talking to a woman next to me and she says, I wasn't watching for wrestling for 20 years, but I started watching AEW because they had Sting on it. that what does that mean for greatness, and kind of how do we can we even quantify that? And I think it's an important thing to think about when you think about lists like this, and kind of like who is remembered, and like how we look at greatness and how we look at influence and historical significance and all of those factors that we like to think about when we talk about making a list like this, beyond just looking at what someone's actual career results were as far as a drawing card.
Yeah, it's great. I'm glad you brought Sting up. He came in at number 42 on the list. And Sting, to me, is probably the best example of the Wrestling Observer bubble. Okay. Dave, I don't care what Dave says. The truth is, Dave has never really cared for Sting at all, even back then. He's not Dave's type. Okay. And so the argument made about Sting is that, well, look, he didn't draw very well as whatever. Look, he was, the top guy in one of the worst periods of wrestling in general. I can use that same argument, and when I frame it this way, you'll see how ludicrous it sounds. Okay, the generation of Steve Austin and The Rock and Bill Goldberg on the other side, the NWO, all that was the biggest, most more eyes saw professional wrestling during that time period than ever saw it before. Okay, so who's your next star? John Cena. Okay, so you can use that same methodology that you're using against Sting to say, well, look, John Cena run off millions of fans. No, that's not true. But John Cena drew quotation marks millions and millions less fans and less ratings than the generation before him. So does that mean John Cena is not one of the worst of all time? Shouldn't be on here? Shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame with all that? No, because it's a business cycle. John Cena probably kept around a lot of people that otherwise would have left. So did Sting. Sting really gets dramatically underrated, in my opinion, more than anything else. Sting was, early in his career, was he the best in-ring worker? No, not really, but he had great charisma. He had great star power. He made a connection with the people. And now, he's relevant today. He's had great longevity. Yeah, he may have had huge, gaps in his career where he wasn't active or whatever, but he's still performing at a pretty darn decent level even to this day. So I think Sting landed exactly about where he was. Before I made this list, I thought to myself, it is fair if Sting ends up around 50 or so. I thought that would be fair. If not, I'm going to feel like there's a bias that exists in there. And then he come in at number 42, which is higher than I expected he did, which goes to show that amongst 30 very different opinions, the average universal consensus is Sting's about number 42, greatest of all time. And I think that's very fair.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, the one thing the list is that because it's mostly American based lists, some lists don't consider Japanese wrestlers or Mexican wrestlers at all. And so, like, I would say, like, if you're looking at the list, like, what is like the greatest offense of the list, or was the list? It's things like like Ricky Dozan is ranked number 30th, Kenta Kobashi is ranked number 56th, Pero Aguayo is 72nd. Like, but that's really just a thing. The people who had those guys on their lists ranked them extremely high, but they weren't on every list, because some lists were US based.
I will say this, that this is something that didn't dawn on me, but was pointed out, and I think this is actually the better way to say it. There's not necessarily wasn't a Japanese bias, because let's face it, Dave really loves his Japanese wrestling, but it was actually a bias in that it's an English language based list. So most of all the lists I used were English, which is going to be largely American, Americans making these lists. And so in the future, if this were ever done again, then yes, I would need to call in some help for some people, to find out what Japanese sources and Mexican sources have made. And it's a good point. It's a valid point that would need to be looked into.
Yeah, it's just saying, like, if I was to point out, like, what is like a real, like, obvious weakness of the list, it is that, like, I think the Japanese and Mexican talents are ranked below what they normally would be, But that's just, again, this is a symptom of what the project was, which was to get a consensus of all the lists that were published, and some of the lists are going to be more in depth in that field than others.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the way it is. But I mean, that's it, Karl. Do you have anything you want to plug at the end of the show?
Well, number one, thank you very much for having me here. I'm greatly honored to be here. You've got a really great podcast here. You've got a great future in doing this, so you continue to do it. Very knowledgeable, and I'm grateful for that. And I would only say that I hope people will check out my website, whenitwascool.com. If you only know me from the classic wrestling shows over at wrestlingobserver.com and figure4online.com, first, thank you. But secondly, I do more than that. I have my own website, whenitwascool.com. We cover not just pro wrestling history, although that is a large portion of it. We also cover retro pop culture, movies, TV, music, more. And I hope you'll check it out. We have a whole podcasting network, articles, the whole 9 yards. Go to whenitwascool.com. You'll see everything I have going on. Thank you for checking it out, and thank you for having me.
All right. Yeah, no, thanks for joining the show, Karl. Appreciate everyone who's been listening to the show, and we'll see you guys all again in the near distant future.